You sat down with them. You were calm. You had thought about it, probably for days. You explained exactly what the new rules were going to be. When the phone goes away, where it charges overnight, how much time on weekends. They nodded. Maybe they pushed back a little and you negotiated. Maybe they even agreed faster than you expected. And by Thursday, it had already fallen apart. Not dramatically, just quietly, incrementally, until you realized the rule you made was being observed in your presence and ignored the moment you left the room. If that's happened more than once in your house, this video is about why. Not why your teenager can't follow rules. Why that kind of rule, built that way, was almost structurally guaranteed to fail. And what a different architecture actually looks like. Here's what most conversations about screen rules get wrong from the start. They treat rule setting as a communication problem. The parent wasn't clear enough. The consequences weren't firm enough. The follow-through wasn't consistent enough. So the advice is always some version of, do the same thing, but better. Be clearer, be firmer, be more consistent. And if you've tried that and watched it fail again at a higher intensity, it's because the problem was never clarity or firmness. The problem was architecture. Here is what the developmental research on adolescence consistently shows. The teenage brain is not malfunctioning when it resists top-down authority. It is doing exactly what it was built to do. Between roughly 12 and 18, the brain undergoes a massive reorganization. One of its purposes is to move the young person toward autonomy, toward independence from the adults who previously made all the decisions. This isn't defiance, it's development, which means a rule that arrives fully formed from a parent as a mandate. Even a reasonable, well-explained, calmly delivered mandate lands in an adolescent brain that is neurologically primed to push back against it. Not because the teenager is difficult, because pushing back against parental authority is, at this stage, part of becoming a person. You weren't doing it wrong. You were using an approach that works reliably for younger children on a brain that has moved past the developmental stage where it works. That's not a verdict on you. That's just the biology of who you're actually talking to now. So what does it actually take for a teenager to genuinely commit to an agreement, rather than just perform compliance until you're out of the room? There is a specific phenomenon that happens in households where screen rules are imposed rather than built. It has a name in the research on adolescent behavior, but the experience of it is something you probably already recognize. It's called compliance theater. Compliance theater is when a teenager agrees to a rule in the room where the rule is made and has no intention of honoring it the moment the conditions that made agreement convenient disappear. It's not lying, exactly. It's a learned behavior that develops when a young person figures out that the fastest way to end an uncomfortable conversation is agreement. Think about the last time your teenager agreed to a limit faster than you expected. Think about what happened 4 days later. Compliance theater isn't a character flaw in your child. It's what develops when the only path to the thing they want runs through agreeing to a rule they didn't help create and have no internal reason to honor once the pressure to agree has lifted. External rules generate external compliance. Observed when someone is watching. Suspended when no one is. And here's the part that matters for what comes next. The distance you feel from your teenager, the sense that they're performing cooperation while quietly doing what they want. That distance often starts here. Not from the screen itself, from the dynamic of enforcement versus agreement, from the slow accumulation of moments where the rule was technically acknowledged and practically ignored. The grief underneath a lot of screen conflicts isn't really about screen time. It's about realizing that your teenager has learned to manage you rather than talk to you, and that is a different problem than the one most screen advice is solving. So what does a rule that actually holds look like, and why does it hold? The short answer is, it holds because the teenager wrote it, not alone, not without structure or limits from you, but with their reasoning visible in the text, with their concerns taken seriously during the drafting, with their name, functionally, on it. Research on adolescent motivation makes something very clear: internal motivation. Doing something because you have a reason to, not because someone is watching, is only available to a young person when they feel some degree of authorship over the expectation. A teenager who was handed a rule is a teenager managing an external constraint. A teenager who helped build an agreement is a teenager with a position to defend. Those are different psychological states. and they produce different behavior when no one is in the room. Here is what the collaborative framework actually involves and what it doesn't. It doesn't mean asking your teenager what rules they want and accepting whatever they say. It doesn't mean surrendering the structure. It means entering the conversation with some things already decided, the non-negotiables, and being genuinely open on everything else. The non-negotiables are yours. They might be no phones in bedrooms after 10, no phones during meals, homework before any screen time. You decide these. They are not up for debate. But how those limits get implemented, the specific rhythm, the specific language of the agreement, what happens when someone slips up, what a good week earns, that is the space where your teenager's authorship lives. The opening of this conversation matters more than any other moment in it. Not, here are the new rules, I want your input. That's still a mandate with a consultation window. Something closer to, I want to figure out something that actually works for both of us. I have things I need, and I know you have things you need. Can we start there? Buy-in requires that the teenager's perspective was genuinely heard before the agreement was finalized. Not acknowledged and then overridden, but actually incorporated. Even in small ways. Even if the structure remains largely what you needed. A teenager who convinced you to move bedtime, charging from 9:30 to 10, has a psychological investment in the agreement that wasn't there before. That half hour isn't a concession. It's authorship. And authorship is what changes the behavior when no one is watching. If you want to take this framework somewhere concrete, there's a done-for-you collaborative agreement template in the description, built specifically for this kind of conversation. It includes the structure, the questions to ask, and a customizable agreement format that parents and teenagers fill out together. It's there whenever you're ready to sit down and actually build something that holds. Now for the objection that is already forming, because it's the right one to have. My teenager won't engage with any process. They'll nod, they'll agree to whatever I say, and then they'll do what they want the moment I'm not watching. That's exactly what you just described. So how is this different? It's a fair challenge. And it deserves a direct answer. The collaborative framework isn't magic. A teenager who has been in compliance theater mode for months or years doesn't shift into genuine engagement because the conversation is reframed. Not immediately. What changes first, and this matters, is you. When you enter the conversation with genuine openness rather than a prepared mandate, something different happens in the room. The teenager who has learned to manage you by agreeing quickly encounters a parent who isn't presenting something to agree to, who is asking real questions, who waits for the actual answer. That disarms the compliance theater response. Not always, not immediately, but often enough to open a different kind of exchange. And when the teenager says something that actually matters, even a small thing, even a grudging preference, you incorporate it visibly. You write it down. You say, that goes in. That moment, the moment the teenager watches their words become part of the document, is the moment the psychological dynamic begins to shift. For the teenager who is genuinely resistant, who refuses to engage at all, the answer is not to force the conversation. It's to be transparent about what happens without it, not as a threat. As information, I'd rather build this together. If we can't, I'll have to set something on my own. And we both know how that tends to go. That's not ultimatum language. That's honesty about the alternative. And for most teenagers, even resistant ones, the alternative of having no voice is worse than the discomfort of having the conversation. One more thing about the first conversation. Keep it short. This is not the conversation where everything gets resolved. This is the conversation where the framework gets introduced and one or two things get agreed on. The goal of the first session is not a complete agreement. It's a teenager who leaves the room having experienced a different kind of conversation than they expected. That is enough. Everything else builds from there. If you want the scaffolding for this conversation already built, the family media plan in the description is exactly that. A template designed for parents and teenagers to fill out together, with the structure already in place and enough flexibility to make it genuinely yours. Link is in the description and the pinned comment. Think back to the last rule that failed in your house. What do you think your teenager would have said if you'd asked them to help write it? Here is what you came in with: the memory of a rule that didn't hold. The frustration of a conversation that ended in agreement and produced nothing. The quiet suspicion that something fundamental had shifted in the dynamic between you and your teenager, and that standard approaches were no longer reaching whatever it had shifted into. That suspicion was correct. Something has shifted. The brain sitting across the table from you now is not the brain that responded to the same approaches that worked at 8 or 10. And the rules that felt sufficient then feel like they're dissolving now because they were designed for a different developmental moment. What you're leaving with is something different. Not a rule. An architecture. A way of building an agreement that your teenager has a psychological reason to honor when no one is watching. Because some part of their reasoning is in the text. One thing. Not a complete overhaul of every screen policy in your house. One conversation, opened differently. One question asked genuinely. One answer written down and incorporated. That's the first conversation. Not the one that resolves everything. The one that establishes that a different kind of conversation is possible. The rule failed because it was built on external pressure alone. What holds is built on something the teenager can feel as their own. Even partially, even imperfectly. That's not weakness in you as a parent. That's understanding how the brain in front of you actually works. And using that understanding to build something real. The child who is still there, the one who has opinions, preferences, reasons, and a genuine desire to be taken seriously, that teenager is exactly who this conversation is designed to reach. Not the managed version. Not the version performing agreement to end the discomfort. The real one. Keep going.